Back in June 1967, 10 explorers went into the Mossdale cave system to explore and help clear out some of the deeper passages for more mapping work. These passages weren't well documented by caving standards, but the two group leaders felt confident they could guide everyone safely through. Dave Adamson, a 26-year-old leader, and his friend Jeff Bureau had explored Mossdale many times before. This cave system wasn't really a tourist cave at all. There were very few areas where you could actually stand up straight. It was mostly brutal crawls, or squeezing through wet spaces packed with rocks and mud. That's why, after a few hours, 4 of the group members, 2 men and 2 women, turned back just like they'd planned. Dave Adamson's fiancée was one of these casual cavers. Morag Forbes was excited about getting married to Dave in less than a month. These adventurers, who were only planning a light day of exploring, left the cave around 5 p.m. The skies were overcast, but nothing looked seriously threatening. Dave and Jeff kept going deep underground with their 4 caving buddies helping with equipment and tools. Colin Vickers, John Ogden, and Bill Frakes were experienced cavers. At just 17 years old, Michael Ryan was the youngest guy in the group. At this point in the day, the men were starting to crawl through the Far Marathon Passage. This claustrophobic tunnel was the length of 3 football fields, over 900 feet of narrow rock with a small stream of water running along the bottom. You have to move through Far Marathon Passage in only one direction because it's just 18 inches by 12 inches. That's barely enough room for an average-sized person to pull themselves along. Imagine crawling in a space not much bigger than your computer screen, with your shoulders pinned forward and no room to spread your arms or reach back to your waist or legs. Once you squeeze in, turning around just isn't an option. You're committed for at least an hour. Near Marathon and Far Marathon are each 900-foot-long crawls. There's a small 5-foot area between the two where you can kind of stand up before starting the next section. When the men reached the last section of Far Marathon, there was more narrowing and an even tighter squeeze to push through. Their goal was to reach the next section of the cave system to clear out passages for more mapping. Around this time, Morag had come back to the entrance to see if the guys were done yet, but she didn't see any signs that the cavers were coming out. It had started raining, though nothing too scary yet. Underground, they were getting ready to clear passages, but noticed the streams had gotten bigger, and groundwater levels were rising a little bit. It definitely would have caught their attention, but might not have seemed like a real threat to their mission. At some point, the water levels became really concerning. The men would have heard the increasing volume of water flow and felt the rising water at their feet. Knowing they were 3 hours away from the entrance, they decided to call it a day. Dave knew this cave system better than anyone, so they figured he would know when to get them out safely. Unfortunately, they had no clue just how much water was headed their way. Morag came back to the cave entrance one last time at 9 p.m. She was absolutely horrified to see a lake of water around the entrance to the cave system. It was completely flooded and totally blocked. Her fear and panic sent her running frantically to get help. The men were trying to get back up the Far Marathon Passage. Even though the water level had risen, they had no choice but to get back to a higher chamber as fast as possible. This extreme distance in such a tight space was probably panic-inducing. With such a heavy flow of water coming at them, all their experience told them to move calmly but quickly to get through this scary situation. For sure, they thought they would come out on the other side in a higher chamber. Young Michael and experienced Jeff were the first 2 to squeeze through the tight starting section on the way back. A body could barely fit through parts of this passage. The cavers had to literally squeeze themselves past the rock and pull themselves forward using just their arm strength. Their rubber boots would drag along the sides to help push them forward as fast as possible. This time, the water was coming right at their faces instead of flowing behind them. Jeff Burrow was familiar with how water flowed in Mossdale. He definitely thought that a quick push through Far Marathon would get him and Michael safely past the dangerous passage and into the bigger chamber above. The other 4 men would have been gathering their gear and getting ready for their own trip into Far Marathon. Now, the water flow was becoming really alarming. Dave Adamson was confident that he knew where to wait out the flash flood from the storm. These experienced cavers started their push with speed in mind. Jeff and Michael started struggling with the flood of water they were facing in the tight passage. It rose above their hands and then their shoulders. They tried to find the highest crack in the passage to lift their faces as water rushed into the tunnel. Michael probably asked Jeff what to do, where to go. The amount of water flooding into the narrow passage just kept increasing, with no safe place to escape. The terrible truth was that there was nothing they could do. Dave had led the others into the same cramped tunnel, hoping to beat the rising water. As they moved through Far Marathon, they ran into the same devastating reality their friends had just faced. The water was too high. They tried to lift their faces above the rising water, looking for the smallest pockets of air, but clearly, there was just no escape from this trap. John Ogden was probably the last one in the tunnel and heard his friends desperately shouting to turn back. Realizing there was no way forward, he pushed with his hands to slide his body backward, using his feet to lift his body weight. He only had moments to make a move before he would be completely underwater too. He found a small crack overhead where he wedged his head and body to grab one last breath of air. Maybe the water would stop rising and he would find protection in this small airspace. It was too tight for a person to actually fit, but in the frantic fight for survival, he jammed his body and face up into the narrow crack. Outside the cave, a full rescue effort was getting started. It was clear that the entrance to the cave was completely blocked by a lake of water, but there was still hope that the men had found a safe chamber to wait in until the water levels dropped. The rescuers came out in full force. Hundreds of volunteers helped build dams around the entrance and set up pumps to try to move the water out of the mouth of the cave. This would let the water levels inside drop, clearing passages for safe movement. On Sunday afternoon, a full day after the men had entered the cave, rescuers were able to make it down to Far Marathon. They shouted a few times, hoping to let the men know that the passage was clear now and they could come down from their high waiting chamber. It wasn't until they saw two sets of legs sticking out from the ridge of the tunnel that the horrible reality hit them. These two bodies were Jeff and Michael, who had lifted their upper bodies into a ridge along the path trying to get to the last breaths of air. The reality of the situation was completely devastating to rescuers who had held onto a thin thread of hope that these experienced cavers had been able to find safety in an air pocket. One by one, the bodies of 5 men were found. John Ogden's body wouldn't be found for another 2 days. He had wedged himself so hard into the overhead crack that it took dozens of searches to locate his twisted remains. All 6 men drowned in a flash flood. They couldn't escape that filled the entire cave with water. The cave was closed after this tragedy and remains the final resting place for the 6 men. In 1970, friends of the cavers entered the closed system to move the bodies to an upper chamber. They renamed it the Sanctuary